Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, welcome to the great train story at the Museum of Science and Industry, featuring the 2,206-mile trip on Amtrak's Empire Builder from Chicago Union Station to Seattle, Washington. Amtrak's first-class service number 7 and 8 Empire Building is now loading by way of Indiana Dunes, Prairie Town, Lake Snowden, Stony Creek and Poughkeepsie Bridge, Mineral Springs, Cascadia, Seattle, Washington by King Street Station, and returning by way of Sap Creek, Last Chance Falls, Glacier Station, Plainview, Corwith Intermodal, Bungalow City, and arriving at Chicago's Union Station. At Chicago's Union Station, connections can be made with the Chicago Transit Authority, L Subway, the Metra Suburban, and the Interurban Chicago South Shore and South End Railroad. All aboard!
The Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago has many fascinating exhibits. There's the coal mine, a Boeing 727 hanging from the ceiling, the German U-505 submarine from World War II, the Burlington Zephyr, and many more. But as exciting and interesting as all these exhibits are, my favorite has always been the operating model railroad. The first model railroad at the museum was built in 1941. Since then, 5 generations of children and their parents have left the museum with indelible memories of model trains running over bridges, around mountains, into tunnels, and through small towns. In 2002, the museum introduced a totally new model railroad, bigger, more detailed, and grander than any of its predecessors. Built in HO scale, the exhibit depicts a 2,206 scale mile journey by train between Chicago, Illinois and Seattle, Washington. 35 trains operate on more than 1,400 feet of track. The spectacular scenery includes more than 500 scale buildings, 28 bridges, a 14-foot replica of the Sears Tower, Seattle's Space Needle, the Cascade Timber Range, a drawbridge over the Chicago River, and a tunnel through the Rocky Mountains. This is the layout this video is about. So sit back, put on your engineer's cap, and climb on board for the great train story. As you enter, you are greeted by models of the spectacular skyline of Chicago.
The Great Train Story is located in the wing of the museum known as the Transportation Gallery. It shares that room with such famous locomotives as the 999 Empire State Express which was the first locomotive to pass the 100-mile-an-hour speed record. So really it was the first person to go 100 miles an hour was on that train, and that's pretty neat. We've got it in the same room as the Great Train story. Also in the Transportation Gallery is the cab from an old Pennsylvania Railroad steam locomotive called the K4 Pacific, which was a really famous locomotive in its time. And people really like this a lot because they can stand in the cab of the locomotive and pull on the throttle and the reversing arm and really pretend they're piloting that locomotive. It's even got little pictures of the railroad ahead of it when you look through the windows. So kids really love that a lot. In the back of the Transportation Gallery are a couple relics of Chicago's public transit past. One of them is called a horse car, which is basically a trolley that didn't get its power from electricity. It was dragged by horses before the CTAL was invented. There's also a cable car there. There was a small cable car system in Chicago, just like the one that you see in San Francisco for those of our visitors who have been there. And that one went up and down State Street a long time ago.
Let's begin our imaginary journey at the far end of the exhibit, in the city of Seattle, Washington. Dawn begins to creep its way over the Cascade Mountains as a big crane in Seattle Harbor unloads containers off a freighter that just arrived from China. The crane places the containers on flat cars, which are part of a 56-car freight train headed for Chicago. It takes a lot of people and machines to run a busy port like this. The captain, the man in charge of the freighter, navigates the ship across the ocean. The harbor pilot in a tugboat helps guide the big freighter to the dock. The crane operator lifts the containers off the freighter and places them on flat cars. The engineer drives the train and makes sure he gets the right containers loaded and delivers his cargo on time. Thousands of containers are being loaded and unloaded every day at ports on both coasts of the United States. The Port of Seattle is one of the busiest. Ships from Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, and Australia arrive almost every day. After the containers are loaded on his train, the engineer waits for the green and then pulls out of Seattle to begin the 2,206-mile trip to Chicago. The King Street Station, with its tall clock tower that can be seen from all around Seattle, was built by James Hill. Hill was a visionary and one of the founders of the Great Northern Railroad. In the late 19th century, he helped establish Seattle as one of the major cities on the West Coast by terminating the Great Northern's westbound route in Seattle. Hill was called the Empire Builder because every place he took his railroad, empires were created. Seattle is brimming with local markets too. Fisheries, art galleries, antique shops, and coffee houses. Seattle is also a leader in architecture. Its many interesting buildings include the Space Needle, and the Experience Music Center, designed by famous architect Frank Gehry. Gary also designed Millennium Park in Chicago. The Seattle waterfront is always churning with tugboats, speedboats. That double-decker highway that runs along the waterfront is called the Alaskan Way Viaduct. Just around the corner from Seattle, we see Sap Creek, a small logging town nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. Logging is a major industry in the Northwest, and the railroad is a valuable partner. Small local trains carry logs to the lumber mill. Then, mainline freights pick up the finished lumber. Here's how logs become the boards you see at your local lumber store. After the logs are brought to the mill, they dry. Then the logs are cut into boards. The boards are bundled, wrapped, and loaded on center beam flat cars, which have a wall down the middle. The wall supports the lumber and prevents damage. The center beam flats then wait on a siding to be picked up by a mainline freight and taken to a lumber yard near you. When you visit the exhibit, look for the interactive buttons. Here in Sap Creek, you press the button and a tree falls. Track planners have lots of obstacles to overcome. Big obstacles, like mountains. How do you get through a mountain? You blast your way through. Glacier National Park is another fabulous attraction of the Northwest. Melting snow from the Great Divide creates spectacular waterfalls. There's an Amtrak station where folks can get off, go for hikes, camping, or for the more adventuresome, to go down the falls in a canoe. Trains play a major role in moving raw materials like coal. Coal is removed from the earth and sent to the surface in mine rail cars. At the mouth of the mine, the coal is dumped into a long conveyor belt that carries it to a storage silo. Since coal is impervious to the elements, open hoppers are used. The hoppers roll under the silo. Hatches open, and the coal is dumped into the hopper cars. After the hoppers are loaded, the train heads for the steel mills south of Chicago, where the coal is used to fuel the blast furnaces. Amtrak number 8 heads out past the residential and light industrial areas of the western suburbs, then approaches an area zoned for heavy industry. The railroad is involved in almost every step of the steel-making process. First, a coal train arrives delivering coal. The coal is packed into ovens and converted to coke to fuel the blast furnace. The hot coke is then dumped into rail cars and taken to another blast furnace where it's converted to pig iron. The pig iron is dumped into hot metal cars, also called torpedo or submarine cars, and taken to still another blast furnace where it's converted to steel. These hot metal cars are insulated